Can we have the roll call, please?
Mayor Edgar,
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Kusamoto,
Here.
Councilmember Churko,
Here.
Councilmember Hasselbrink,
Here.
Councilmember Murphy.
Here. Okay, for members of the public, Mayor Edgar is out of town. He has properly posted the meeting notice agenda, and I assume you have your door open over there, Troy?
The door is open and nobody is in the room with me, but their access there and it's posted at the front door also.
Okay, so when it comes time for the public hearing portion, I'll open it on your end as well, but I'll go ahead and ask for a staff report on item 3A, the public hearing.
Cool. Thank you.
Good evening, Council. So tonight is the first meeting of 5 public hearings to discuss transitioning to district-based election system. On May 11th, the City Council adopted its resolution of intention to transition from at-large to district-based elections. And this would commence at the November 2020 election. The purpose of this public hearing is to inform the public about the districting process and to hear from the community on what factors should be taken into consideration while creating district boundaries. Tonight we have Vice President Dr. Justin Levitt from our demographer company, NDC. He's going to provide a presentation outlining the process. As Mayor Pro Tem Kusamoto mentioned, Mayor Edgar is participating via phone, so we'll need to open the public hearing in both locations, and all votes will need to be done by a roll call vote. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Levitt.
Thanks, sir.
So, thank you. Thank you to the members of the council, members of the public who are here tonight. My name is Dr. Levitt, and it's a pleasure to be here tonight to talk about this matter. So what are we here tonight to look at? I want to start just at the very basics of what we're doing here. And really what we're talking about doing is switching from an at-large election system to a by-district election system. An at-large election system is where the entire city gets to vote for all 5 members of the council, 2 in 1 year, one cycle, 3 on the other cycle. And what we're looking at changing here tonight is to a by-district system. Now, we're familiar with the by-district system because we use it for the state assembly, state senate, Congress, county board of supervisors. And what it means is that each representative will have to live in a single, in an area equal to 1/5 of the city's population. And only the voters within that area will get to choose the representative from that area. And this is because of a law that I'm going to talk about in a second called the California Voting Rights Act, which encourages jurisdictions to switch to this by-district form of election. Now, there are alternatives. In the middle, we talk about from residence districts. Some cities, I know you might have heard of Mission Viejo, looking at cumulative voting or other methods. These are kind of iffy under the California Voting Rights Act. The California Voting Rights Act is written in a way that really only exempts districts or cities, or just say jurisdictions generally, if they have by-district elections, if they have single-member districts with one member being elected only by the residents of that district. And law gives cities, AB 350, gives cities 90 days to make this transition. And it actually requires quite a lot. We have to fit 5 public hearings into 90 days. And so the first 2 hearings it requires are only on the composition of districts. So we don't have any maps here tonight. There's no maps that have been drawn. We're not even allowed to put pen to paper until after the second public hearing, which will be next Monday, June 4th. After that, we will begin to post draft maps, and we'll come up with at least 3 concepts. Members of the public are invited to help us contribute to this process, which we'll talk about throughout the presentation. These have to be posted at least a week before the 3rd public hearing. So posted on by June 11th, so that they'll be available to discuss on the June 18th public hearing. That public hearing, I'll just note, will be at 5 p.m. All the other public hearings will be at 6 p.m. The 4th public hearing, July 9th, and the 3rd public hearing on June 18th, those are meetings to try to develop the plan further. What works, what doesn't work in those initial draft concepts, hopefully narrowing down the options to one map that works well for the city. And this will not be used this November for the November 2018 election. We're actually too late. We've missed the registrar's deadlines for these maps for this year. So the first election these can possibly be used for is the November 2020 election, in which the first 2 areas will be up, and then the remaining areas will be up in 2022. Now, this, of course, this creates a very interesting situation because we're required to redistrict or redraw these lines following every census. And we'll have the 2020 census right in the middle, right between our first election using these districts lines and second election. And so we'll be drawing 3 districts that will never actually hold an election because we'll have to relook at our lines following the 2020 census because populations may have changed, new projects, new housing, especially in a city this size, could mean the difference between districts that are balanced in terms of population and districts that are not. And so why are we doing this now, and especially why are we doing this within the next 90 days? Well, to take a step back, we have to understand this in the context of the California Voting Rights Act. This is a 2002 law, basically signed right as Gray Davis was facing his recall election, designed to encourage cities to switch from at-large elections to by-district elections. Now I say 2002, that's a long time ago. What happened was that initially it seems like there were only a handful of cities that were targeted by the law. Modesto in the Central Valley. Many of them had a lot of questions about the law. There were a number of cases about it or that resulted in settlements. Palmdale was the only city to have gone to trial based on the law. And the settlements proved very large. Palmdale alone, the settlement came out to $5 million, which doesn't include what the city spent on its own defense. The first big case in Modesto, Modesto spent somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 million, as you can see in the presentation. And other jurisdictions have spent 6 figures or 7 figures as well fighting the law. And none of these totals up here include what the cities have spent on their own defense or actually going through the process of districting after they settled or lost the case. And this has affected cities and districts, school districts, healthcare districts, community college districts statewide, all over the state. I mean, I worked with Cypress Elementary last year on their districting process. We've worked with Magnolia 2 years ago on transitioning to districts. And of course, you probably have heard of some of the bigger cities in the area like Anaheim and Fullerton that have switched. But it's not only affecting big cities, and we keep seeing that populations of cities that are being targeted has gotten smaller. Tehachapi, for example, population 9,000, got a letter about 3 or 4 months ago, for example. So a lot of jurisdictions have been targeted under this law, and a new law that came into effect 2 years ago gives cities 90 days to make this transition, in which you cannot be further sued. Basically, it's sort of a grace period. It's AB 350 gives you this 90-day grace period that we're operating under. And so what do we require once we start going to district elections? Well, there's sort of the list of things that cities must do under the red column, federal laws. And then there's the may do, things that the state encourages you to take a look at that have to be balanced with the things that the federal government must do. And so the main criteria is equal population. The Supreme Court said well before the Voting Rights Act that districts have to be equal in terms of the total number of people. And this includes everyone. Children, non-citizens, everybody counted on April 1st, 2010 is included as this total population total that we have to equalize between the districts. In addition, we do have to consider the Federal Voting Rights Act. And the Federal Voting Rights Act requires us to look at groups that have historically faced discrimination or barriers to registration or voting, language minorities, such as Latino communities, Asian communities, and see where there are neighborhoods or areas where there's a higher than average or higher concentration of these groups. I mean, race cannot be the only criteria that justifies the creation of a district. It can't even be the primary consideration, but it has to be one of many factors that we think about and balance as we move through this process. And I know that's a little bit complicated, and we'll talk about that. We'll see some slides showing some of the questions as we move on. These are the things we must do. Now, on the right-hand column, we have things that we have to balance with this. And the number one of these is communities of interest. You know, I grew up in a town of 10,000 people. I know that it always seems like, you know, we're all one we're one community. We don't have distinctive neighborhoods. But, you know, communities of interest are the kinds of things that do divide people, even in a community as small as this one. You know, for example, people who live on the same street or go to the same park, people who are influenced by a particular facility like a school, a military base, a particular heavily trafficked road. And these are going to differ somewhat throughout the city. And we're going to try to understand what your communities of interest are in these first two public hearings, and again, as we move throughout the process. We can look and we're going to see some of the demographic factors that we have taken into, or we're going to start to look at, but we also want to hear from you on what the communities of interest are. In a city this size, often there's concerns about making sure that all the public facilities are divided evenly throughout the 5 districts. That areas that are perhaps need more investment may need to be kept together or may need to be divided so that more than one council member has a stake in that particular neighborhood. Because that is something that a lot of cities think about, especially this size, that when we talk about communities of interest and we talk about projects and places that we need or that the city is working on, that they shouldn't all stay in one district, but they should be divided between multiple council members so that more than one council member has a stake in that particular project or neighborhood. We see this a lot with downtown areas or major redevelopment projects. So in addition to that, if we could put the slides back up, we have to consider the shape of the district, compactness, contiguity, following visible boundaries, to the extent that we can, using major roads, using canals, or using other features that serve to divide neighborhoods logically, rather than jogging through a neighborhood, rather than dividing an apartment complex in half, for example. We have to consider that. We also want to consider growth, where we know that things have changed since 2010, where we know things might be changing as we look forward to the 2020 census. Can we take those factors into account now so that in 2020 we don't have to shift the lines as much? And finally, respecting the voters' wishes is the principle that, especially under the California Voting Rights Act, that the city has elected a council, and that redistricting shouldn't be used as a way of targeting a particular council member, you know, because that doesn't respect the voters' wishes of having elected a council. And so, as part of this process, we're going to be looking at a lot of data. I'm not going to go through all the different data here because I'm inviting you to look at it on your own and figure out which factors are most relevant to you. But I'm going to highlight just the variety of data that we have to show you today, and that we can show you throughout the process. We use a lot of census data, not just on race, but also looking at everything from income, education, language spoken at home. In addition, we use renters, where you have more rental properties, where you have more homeowners, where you have differences in income and education, and all sorts of demographic differences that we can consider. In addition, we do look at race. We do look at the total population, about 11,500 people. That means that each of the 5 districts will have just over 2,000 people, just about 2,200 or so. And so that's our target number for equalizing the population between districts. We also are looking specifically for Voting Rights Act reasons, that where your Latino and Asian American communities are. And we can see that, you know, there's not really a huge concentration in the city. I mean, if you look at it just kind of like maybe like along Catella Boulevard, especially in this part of this part of Los Alamitos, maybe there's a slightly higher concentration, but it's not like there's a specific neighborhood or area that's the Latino neighborhood of town. In fact, there's only 1 or 2 census blocks on the entire map where Latinos make up over 50% of the population. And we look at the same thing with the Asian American population. With the exception of 1 census block that has, I think, just about 70 people in it. It's also where the Los Alamitos High is. Or no, sorry, it's the middle school, McAuliffe Middle School. That's the only block where Asians make up a majority of the population. But we see that there's a lot of blocks where Asians and Latinos make up 25, 30% of the population. And so from this perspective, the Voting Rights Act, you know, we're gonna have to balance this. We're gonna look and see what's possible to draw, but we're not gonna be able to draw a majority Latino or majority Asian American district, and under the Voting Rights Act requirements. We also look at other factors, like I mentioned. For example, we have a map of renters versus owners in the upper right-hand side. The pink area, it's a census tract, so it's a regional average. Is an area with a higher than average percentage of renters. Other parts of the city, for example, like on the base itself, or in the areas kind of along Los Alamitos Boulevard, have a lower percentage of renters. We also have on the lower right-hand column, I believe this is degree or education levels. But we have a lot of factors that we can consider, and that we can show you if there's any requests or anybody wants to see them. All this information is from the census. We're happy to make it available in a form that you can use. You can visualize it throughout the process. And so finally, we turn to what we're here to do tonight, which is to begin to answer questions about this process. What questions do you have as we go through the process? And especially for those of you who are thinking about wanting to influence the way these lines are drawn, where are your communities of interest? Where are your neighborhoods? What facilities, what areas, what concerns do we have that we should take into account when we start drawing district lines after the second public hearing? Because it's one thing to look at a map. It's another to actually hear from people. Tell us, this is important here. You know, I've been to 50 or 100 different cities now. We always hear different concerns raised in every town I've gone to. And so tell us what your concerns are as we go through the districting process that we can take into account as we move through it. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions, and I look forward to hearing from all of you tonight.
Thank you, Dr. Levitt. So bringing it back here, I think the appropriate thing is to open public hearing, and we're going to open up in 2 places, over where Mayor Edgar is and public hearing over here. So I'll invite anybody, a member of the public that wishes to come forward to speak on this issue, to come forward and provide your input. Well, let's start with Mayor Edgar. Anybody on your end that wishes to come forward?
No, the doors are open and there is no one present at this point.
Okay, so we'll bring it back here to Los Alamitos. Anybody, a member of the public, wishes to come forward and speak on this matter?
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem and Mayor. My name is Joel Block. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you about this important issue. Want to express a couple of observations. Apparently, as I understand it, the city received a letter that started this entire process. According to the paperwork that's displayed on the city website, an attorney sent a letter, and that is what triggered this process. No legal action has actually taken place. I hope that what I'm saying will be confirmed in terms of the actual circumstances. I want to contrast that to another letter that the city received about another important matter concerning the city's ordinance regarding the California Fair Values
I
Act.
may interrupt, sir. That is not relevant to this hearing, so I'd ask you to stick to the matter on this hearing.
All right, well, I just want to say that action is taking place very rapidly on one letter concerning the districting, with a commitment of funds on the part of the city, trying to stay within a state safe harbor provision that was alluded to by the demographer. And that requires apparently, completed process within this 90-day grace period. I want to ask the city whether they'd even explored extending the grace period, since the plan is to hurry everything up, get it all done, and then it's only going to have an effect on the particular districts drawn on 2 of the 5 districts. As the demographer mentioned, there's 3 districts are going to have to go under redistricting as a result of the next 2010 census. My biggest concern is about transparency. And I urge the fact that, if there are 0 people at the other hearing, and there's approximately, 4 or 5 people at this hearing, I don't think the city has done a very good job in doing outreach to let the city residents know, whether they are citizens or non-citizens, that a very important step is being taken by the city. You published an article in the Press Enterprise. I don't know if you did anything else to get attendance at today's hearing, the first of 5. Another matter.
Thank you, sir. Time's up.
What is the time limit for this hearing, for the speakers at this hearing?
It's 3 minutes for agendized items.
Thank you. Your time's up.
Good evening. I'm Barbara Farrell, and I'm a resident of Los Alamitos, and I'm a voter here. Regarding the redistricting, I have my concerns about transparency. It looks like we're looking at it properly. It is a bit of a rush job, unfortunately, but I hope that more people will be able to give their input in the future. I'm interested in the redistricting to address shared demographics characteristics, which is, in my mind, more of a similar income areas, since I've just found out that we don't have any concentrations by neighborhood of Latinos or Asian people. There's a lot of white people and there's other people scattered everywhere. I'd like to see some people in shared districts so they have a voice. I also believe that the map should reflect some sort of natural dividing line, not all squiggly, let's include this person and that person. In the future, that won't make any sense, and you'll be down this road again. So those are the 2 things that I wanted to mention tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
My name is Carol Sylvia, and I've lived here since 1963. The thing that bothers me about this whole thing is that right now we have one staff, one city staff. Each one of you doesn't have an office that is shared by people, that has people that support your staff or support your getting reelected. And that's one of the beauties of our size. Now, I understand that we have nothing to do about, we can do nothing about this. I understand that. But this is going to do nothing but make government larger. And so I therefore am against it because of that. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Okay, nobody else. We'll go ahead and close the public hearing and bring it back here to the council. And I'd like to ask any questions of staff or of the consultant demographer. Richard, do you have anything?
Yes. Does religion come into play at all here?
So that's a good question. The census doesn't have data on religion. It doesn't ask questions about which religious group you are. If we know that there are particular communities of whatever group, Sikh, Muslim, Jewish, whatever, then we can take that into account, but we rely on members of the community to tell us where those neighborhoods are.
So even though all the race and everything else is considered equal under the Constitution, in the case here, race counts much more than religion,
Well,
even though both freedoms are
so
important.
So the Voting Rights Act talks about protected classes on the basis of historic discrimination, which was done on the basis of race or ethnicity. The census has never collected data on religion, and that has never served in the United States as a barrier to registration and voting in the same way.
I could see where probably groups don't want to give that information, fearing it would be used against them. So, I mean, I can see why it's not collected.
Let's go to the First Amendment.
Yeah, thank you.
Just a couple of comments and maybe a question. So you said that we had 11,600 residents, but out of those, only 6,300 are registered voters.
Yeah.
So if you divide that by 5, that's really going to be your voting base for each district, correct? Because, I mean, those 11,000 include kids.
Yes.
You know, things like that.
And actually, this is where we get one of these interesting questions that, you know, the census, or the Supreme Court requires the total number of people be equalized. Now, I think in this case, you're going to have similar numbers of registered voters between districts. In larger cities, that's not always the case.
Right. And I just want to make a comment for the public. You know, this was advertised everywhere, Facebook, our website, next door, in the paper. I mean, it was as much as we could do. This was not something that was driven by us. It was driven by an attorney in Malibu who's been going up and down the state, as you had also presented. I personally don't see how this is going to improve our city or our election process. As a voter now, I only get to vote for 20% of my government, not 100% of my government. I don't know how that does us better. You know, the last election, people were voted into office with 1,800 to 2,000 votes. Divide that by 5, now you're looking at 400 to 500 votes to get into office. If there's a district that isn't real active as far as somebody's not interested in running, now we're left with appointing somebody who may or may not be interested in doing it, but we need somebody in that district now as opposed to getting the top 5 that represent our small city. So I just wanted to voice my opinion on, we're doing this, you know, to follow this letter to avoid future litigation after the 90 days. And so as you can see, it was quite costly for a lot of cities. A city has not won this yet. They're trying to, but their coffers are much deeper than ours. And so we are going through the process to stay compliant with it, but not necessarily, at least in my opinion, agreeing with it. So, thank you.
Sure. Some of my comments may be somewhat repetitive of Councilmember Hasselbrink's, but for the public benefit, you know, this was not the idea of any council member. As Councilmember Hasselbrink mentioned, this is being driven by threat of litigation from an outside attorney, and you know, we're being forced down this path legally, like so many cities and school districts before us, and it is frustrating for us that, you know, when you look at the demographics of our city, this doesn't even seem to be necessary, and it doesn't even seem like it's going to bring any sort of benefit to our city. We don't have any area in our city where a certain population is more represented than other areas. But sadly, the ordinance, as I understand it, the laws don't allow us to take that into consideration. And as Councilmember Hasselbrink said, this is taking voting power away from our residents. People previous to this had a say in all 5 council members, and now they're only going to get a say for one council member that lives in their district. So, you know, I think a lot of us up here are not in favor of this, but we don't see another path based on what we know, based on other cities' experiences, and based on the potential cost to our city. I mean, you see some of the settlements, $4 million, $3 million, significant money. So I don't have any questions. Those are just my comments.
Thank you. Okay, I'll go, and then I'll let you go last, Troy, if that's okay with you. So,
Sure, thank you.
I guess a little bit of a background. I think some of the questions raised by the public and maybe for the viewers, it was said by the colleagues up here, this was something that was driven by an outside attorney. And I want to look to Michael, if you can kind of just give a little bit of a background on to what Mr. Shankman does. This is something is well known. It's been done in other cities. I think our demographer has helped other cities because of this individual doing what he's doing. So could you kind of just describe it at a high level, the process is because of the California voting rights?
Yeah, sure. So under the California Voting Rights Act, a potential plaintiff can send a demand letter to a city asserting that the plaintiff feels that there is racially polarized voting in that jurisdiction. Under the law as amended, a city will then have 30 days to adopt a resolution of intention indicating their desire to transition to district-based voting. If that resolution of intention is not approved by the city within that period, the plaintiff, in this case, Mr. Shankman, would be able to move forward with a lawsuit against the city.
And he has kind of a formula that he does, right? Is that and it's kind of well known in terms of how he approaches these things with other cities.
Yeah, the approach and the letter that the city received is consistent with letters you see in nearly every other city he has approached. It is somewhat formulaic. It's a simple demand saying, making an assertion of this racially polarized voting and threatening a lawsuit if the city doesn't take immediate action to transition.
And then the 90-day safe harbor, that's also, again, it's kind of putting the gun to our head to make us act quickly, correct?
Yeah, well, and to be fair, the 90-day period is not imposed either by the city nor Mr. Shankman. This is amendments to the law that it provides a safe harbor to the city, allowing us to make that transition. It's an incredibly tight schedule to have the 5 public hearings within that time frame, but if a city is able to make the transition within that specified statutory time frame, it limits the city's ultimate financial exposure. If you do not make the transition within that time frame or refuse to, that opens the door for much more extensive attorney's fees.
And that's, I think, Mission Viejo may be facing some pain in that regard.
That's correct.
Okay. And then City Clerk, if you can kind of describe some of the outreach that you've done, and have you got any extraordinary outreach on this?
In regards to the public hearings?
Yes.
So for the public hearings, we did advertise in the News Enterprise as required in the 4 different languages, English, Spanish, Vietnamese, and Korean. We did put a notice on LATV that's been circulating for the last 3 or 4 weeks. Okay. We posted it on our website, and I posted it several times to our social media outlets.
And then next door neighbor, I think Councilmember Hasselbrink mentioned there. And is that something you typically do? I haven't seen things from the city before on next door.
Next door neighbor, I did not personally post, but I believe it was shared by someone else. Okay. But we don't have access to post directly
I know,
there.
Stephen was able to do a one-way because you can't get the feedback, but
right.
That's something that above and beyond, I think, what we would typically see from the from your office, correct?
Correct. Mm-hmm.
And any other outreach that you've done? Twitter, anything like that? Twitter?
So our Facebook automatically posts to Twitter, so it would be in both locations.
Okay, so we've reached out as best we can, alert the public, and I think as this process goes, we're in the first of 5. Again, as we start getting closer to the maps, I hope that we'll get more participation. And that's kind of all the right now that I have. I do want to thank Dr. Levitt for being here, and then I'm going to turn over to Mayor Edgar. You have questions, comments, sir?
Yeah, a couple of items. Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem Kosimoto. A question, the public comments that we received, I could hear them okay, but could I, out of the people that spoke, were any of them from the city of Los Alamitos? I mean, just for my own edification, I apologize, I'm not there.
I'll hazard a guess. I believe 2 of the 3 are Los Al residents. 1, I believe, is a resident of Rossmore.
Okay. And then, I would say, just echoing everything that has been said about kind of a force down, but, probably a little bit more history. So this Voting Rights Act was voted in 2001. So it's one of those rights on the books that have been out there for quite a while. It has been challenged in Supreme Court and California Supreme Court being unconstitutional and potentially having a lot of monikers thrown on it of whether, it was racially motivated or what the situation was. But I would just tell you from my vote of 1 of 5 that, I'm going with this process that is going really quickly, but I like Councilmember Turco, adamantly opposed to what is being kind of forced down upon us. The question about outreach, I think that we need to take those comments that we heard through the public comment really seriously, especially the ones of trying to get the outreach. We have a TV station, and I would recommend that this segment, where we got the introduction, we got some public comments, and you can see that only 3 people came. We should be putting this up. We have that TV station, and we help through the city manager's office set this schedule. And I would think that we would really start seeing if it was possible. So my first question is the city manager. Is it possible to record, take this recording and put it into more of a rotation on our TV channel? Yes or no?
Yes, we can do that.
And I mean, how extreme? Because I got to be honest, if the community wants this council to fight this more than it can, we need to do everything on our part to make sure that they hear about it, see about it. We'll talk a little bit of how to get this out in the press other than just the TV. But, if we're only having 2 to 3 people show up, and this will significantly change the dynamics of our election process in Los Alamitos. And, I would argue statistically data sets you free on this one and really, does not add any value to the voting base. I mean, we have a hard time filling commissioners, let alone on council members now to specific districts. So I think it's absolutely a bad situation, but it is state law and it has been challenged. And, and at this point, if there is not more of a community interest, then we need to try to drive this up. The deadline that the city attorney talked about, or the timing to go through this process, was 90 days, 5 hearings. Is that correct, city attorney?
That's correct.
Yeah, so this is going to feel like a shove down to the community, and I think we have to over-communicate. And when I say city manager putting this out on the TV, I would think that we should be having this thing show 2 to 3 or 4 times a day in half-hour slots so the community gets it. I think we should be talking about a strategy with the News Enterprise and trying to get it in the local paper, and we should be putting out a press release really quickly. When I look at this staff report, the thing that's hard to kind of get your mind around is something the first speaker talked about, which is when you read it, it does look like it's kind of being driven from us. It takes description that, hey, there was a letter that came in, and that letter kind of threatened us, and we use the data from all the cities around us. I'm not sure in 10 or 12 years from now, somebody picks up the staff report, they're actually going to see like we were kicking and fighting. It looks like it's a pretty orderly staff report that makes it look like we know what we're doing. So I would like to be able to see if there was any way to add information, I guess it'd be in the meeting minutes at this point, that talks a little bit about the history that Mayor Pro Tem Kusamoto kind of laid out, more than what is in the staff report, because you really don't kind of get the essence of kind of why we're doing this and why there's such a sense of urgency. Probably the other thing, city attorney, when I look through this, I try to find references to the California Voting Rights Act in here. It talks about our resolution. It talks about the hearings and the process. But is there anywhere in the staff report, or maybe I missed it, that actually calls out the state law and why we're doing this, and how it sat for potentially 16 years until it got to us in any of the material either provided to us or is online for the public?
Yeah, the staff report itself, the one statutory reference is to Election Code 110, which is the safe harbor provision we're operating under. I think there was a more replete description of the legal background in the staff report that accompanied your resolution of intention. Hearing what you're saying tonight, we will make sure moving forward that the staff reports have a more replete overview of what steps we've taken and how we've gotten to each point in the public hearing process.
Okay. Okay, and then I guess Wendy, city clerk, city manager, and the rest of the council, I mean, are we open to going through this process and actually constructing a press release that we would put out? You know, I don't know what the normal distribution list is for the press release, but I really do think, you know, we cannot communicate this enough to the community. The worst thing that could happen is the community has a reaction that feels like we have really tried to do something slick here when, you know, we're sitting back. I mean, the fact that I'm calling in, this has really been unplanned. This is not something that we were able to put on our calendar, you know, 40 days ago and say, hey, look, we're going to have to go really quickly through 5 hearings. So I just want to make sure that we're providing the community the context so they actually, you know, go through this and understand what we're going through. So I guess, Mayor Pro Tem, that those are the only comments that I had and requests for action.
Okay, thank you. Back here to the council, any other questions or thoughts?
Excuse me, Wendy, I would just like, in your outreach, can you add OC Breeze to your regular outreach for the local media?
Just to clarify, they do get any press releases that we send out in public hearing notices. They
But
are
as far
included.
as something that you send for like the news enterprise, knowing that they're online, it's just if we're trying to do outreach, this would be something that if we're putting it on our website and Nextdoor and Facebook, that any local media that has an audience for our area should be contacted as well, whether it's a formal press release or just an FYI type banner.
And to members of the public as well. I mean, we'll all share, I think, on our social media accounts. But, to the extent you can share as well, that helps us get the word out too.
Yeah, and city manager's office will work with city clerk's office. We'll do everything that we can to supplement the social media that has been out there so far, but we'll continue to work with LoSal TV and work with any other options that we can come up with to get the word out.
Real quick, and I did monitor Nextdoor, and there was a posting about it, and the responses don't match who showed up here tonight, as far as there were much more responses behind somebody's computer than actually who showed up for public comments. So the word is out there. I know we can do a better job, but we weren't doing this in secret and invited just a few for public comments. Just want to make that real clear.
Thank you. And then I guess for my part, the last, what I was thinking about, based on what Mayor Edgar was talking about, some kind of a frequently asked questions, maybe sheet that we can, as an addendum, and it may grow and a living document of some type. That might be helpful, and then you can put that on the city's website, and we can also post it to our social media, for our contacts. So I think, so back to us. I'll look for a motion on the timeline that is attachment 1. Is there a motion for approving that? Or
So moved.
Murphy moved.
I'll second.
Churko second. Any further discussion on the timeline? Troy, any questions on the timeline? So
No, nothing here. Thank you.
So in this case, we'll ask for a roll call vote. Motion by Murphy, second by Churko.
Roll call, Mayor Edgar,
Aye.
Mayor Pro Tem Kusamoto,
Aye.
Councilmember Turco,
Aye.
Councilmember Hasselbrink,
Aye.
Councilmember Murphy.
Aye.
Okay, thank you. And that takes care of item 3. Item 4, we have 2 pieces of agenda topics for closed session. Will you take us into closed session, City Attorney?
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. The City Council will now adjourn into closed session to discuss items listed as 4A and 4B on your special meeting agenda.
Thank you all.